Hey everybody, welcome to the Free Assange Vigil 43.3. My name is Steve Poikinen. I am joined by my co-hosts Andrew Smith and Kendrick Christian. We have an incredible show for you today. We're going to do a deep dive into the labor leaks, which should depose nearly everyone in that party. We will be joined by Mohammed El-Mazi. But first, let me run through some numbers real quick. It is 3,434 days since the beginning of the illegal and arbitrary detention of Julian Assange. 387 days since he was trafficked out of the Ecuadorian embassy, sold, as it were, for a $4.2 billion IMF loan. Reality Winner has been incarcerated for 1,063 days. In 2 days, there will be a case management hearing for Julian Assange. We will definitely be covering that. And on a positive note, Chelsea Manning has been out of jail now for 50 days. And the 10-year WikiLeaks grand jury is no more. So like to end this little round of numbers on a positive note. And we definitely wish the best for Chelsea Manning. Before we get into the labor leaks, I would like to highlight one piece of Julian Assange related news. If we could go to the El País article and kind of walk through that a little bit, that would be cool, because this is written by Stella Morris. And if you've been living under a rock, Stella Morris, Julian Assange's fiance, mother of his 2 young children, she was forced to basically out herself in order to head off the press coming after her. So it just, the amount of like courage that she had and the amount of fury that I have because this thing had to happen, about on par. Does anyone want to take the lead on this, or should I just go ahead?
I can take the lead on it if you want.
Go for it, buddy.
So, the life of my partner, Julian Assange, is at severe risk. He is on remand at HMP Belmarsh, and COVID-19 is spreading within its walls. Julian and I have 2 boys. Since becoming a mother, I've reflected on my own childhood. My parents are European, but that was when I was little. But when I was little, we lived in Botswana, 5 miles from the border of apartheid South Africa. Many of my parents' friends who came across the border, writers, painters, conscientious objectors, it was an unlikely center for artistic creativity and an intellectual exchange. The books describe apartheid as an institutional segregation, but it was much more than that. Segregation occurred in broad daylight. The adjunction, torture, and killing occurred at night. We were totally exposed. The forces operated in a legal and ethical vacuum that engulfed us. The foundations of the apartheid system were precarious, so the regime met ideas of political reform with live ammunition. In June 1985, the South African assassination squads crossed the border armed with machine guns, mortars, and grenades. As soon as gunfire burst into the night, my parents wrapped me in a blanket. I slept in my parents' raced car to blah. I slept as my parents raced the car to safety. The sounds of explosions carried through the capital for an hour and a half, and it took to kill 12 people. The first person to be killed was a very close family friend, an exceptional painter. South Africa claimed the raid had targeted the armed wing of the ANC. In reality, most of the victims were innocent civilians and children killed as they lay sleeping in bed. We left Botswana within days. I had absorbed my parents' vivid memories of the raid. If the terrible night shaped my perceptions of the world, the incarnation of my father, the father of my children, surely marks theirs. Forming my family with Julian under the circumstances was always going to be difficult, but our hopes escalated but our hopes eclipsed our fears. Initially, Julian and I managed to carve a space for a private life. Our firstborn visited with the help of a friend. When Gabriel was 6 months old, an embassy security contractor confessed to me that he had been told to steal the baby's DNA through a nappy, which is a diaper. Failing that they would take the baby's pacifier, the whistleblower warned me Gabriel should not come to the embassy anymore. It was not safe. I realized that all the precautions I had taken for piling layers onto layers of disguise to my bump to change my name would not protect us. We were totally exposed. The forces operating in a legal and ethical vacuum had engulfed us.
Thank you for reading that, Andrew. I think that this article is quite affecting, like moving even, further down. I really, one of the parts that struck me was even at the very end where she said, it's not just our family who suffers from the infringement of Julian's rights. If our family and Julian's lawyers are not off limits, then nothing is. Excuse me. The person responsible for allegedly ordering the theft of Gabriel's DNA is Mike Pompeo, who last month threatened the family members of lawyers working at the International Criminal Court. Why? Because the court had had the temerity to investigate alleged U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan, the same crimes that Julian exposed through WikiLeaks and which the U.S. wants to imprison him over. Julian needs to be released now for him, for our family, and for the society we all want our children to grow up in. So I really like that she brought it, back to that point, because that really is what all this is about. It's about, someone who had the integrity to publish information that exposed U.S. war crimes. And that's just something that the U.S. government will go to any lengths to hide, including completely getting rid of free speech if necessary.
And as a parent,
here, I'm trying to put out some promotional tweets. Mo, you've been more on the ground than anyone else out of obviously us because we're in the States. What is the general sentiment in the UK journalist community about the Stella Morris outing herself, about the revelations that she's been able to give us over the last few weeks, and specifically, what is your take on the CIA, Mike Pompeo, and the State Department ordering a DNA test from a dirty diaper?
So thank you for having me on your show. In terms of the ordering of, I think it was also UC Global, the Spanish private security firm, which was tasked with protecting the Ecuadorian embassy, but then appears to have been recruited in the end to work for the CIA to actually surveil and spy upon Julian Assange. Among the various things that were discussed, there's the seeking out of DNA, which I suppose I understand why. They want to see if there is a biological connection between Assange and the baby. What do I think about that? I mean, I would say that's clearly illegal. That's clearly illegal conduct. Not that anybody is on the horizon of being prosecuted for that. It's, to borrow a phrase, shocking but not surprising, especially when you see some of the other allegations by two whistleblowers from UC Global, that among the things that started to be discussed with the CIA included the possibility of kidnapping Assange out of the embassy or even poisoning him. And those are discussions that they allege in their witness statements that were being had between the CIA and elements of the security firm UC Global. So it fits in line with that sort of theme, that pattern. In terms of the reaction of the news from Stella coming out, and identifying herself as Assange's partner and the mother of his child. Well, as with many things on the subject, it's been mixed, right? So not as much, at least as far as I can tell. I mean, she might say otherwise, obviously being on the receiving end, but not as much piling on as perhaps I might have feared. Some of us might have feared. I have seen some well-known commentators and journalists on Twitter, people who have like large followings. When it first came out, when it was first revealed that he'd have a relationship with her, it was mockery, I think, and contempt from some of them. Although they were pilloried online for it. There's one female Guardian journalist who actually works in mental health. That's one of her focuses, and
that's Hannah Parkinson, right?
That might be
her name, and I'll shame that journalist, Hannah Parkinson.
I can't. In all honesty, I can't remember if that's her. She did come out with a tweet saying, when there was a picture of Assange and a baby that was on the Daily Express, I think, or the Express, she had said, "I'll be." Was it something to the effect of vomiting for the next week? Or
excuse me while I go vomit. Yeah,
excuse me while I go
over
vomit.
an adorable picture of a man holding his child. That makes sure want to vomit.
And also, it shows I think the extent to which mainstream journalists are influenced, as all human beings are, right, to greater and lesser extents depending on the subject matter, influenced by just the level of sort of anti-WikiLeaks, anti-Assange propaganda that's been pumped out there. She really, if she thought she was judging the room in a particular way, blowing with the wind, going the way the wind was blowing, she, I think, might have been well surprised given the number and nature of replies to that tweet. I don't know if she still got it up there. I mean, I replied to it as well.
No,
I said,
she's deleted that tweet. She had the whole thread's gone. Yeah.
Oh, is it? Has it gone?
Yeah, I looked for it the other day because I was going to try and reference it in a Slow News Day broadcast. Totally gone, scrubbed from even my replies and Christine Assange's replies. Gone.
Yeah.
And there were some good zingers in that one, man.
Yeah.
A little upset.
I think I might have taken a screenshot of it on the assumption that it might be deleted when I started to see the replies. I'll check my, I'll check my phone if you can remember the date when she put it out there. But that once again, that reflects because I had followed it for a while and she hadn't deleted it. So that just reflects the level of and the nature of the responses. I mean, I just pointed out the fact. I said, hey, look, here's somebody that the UN says, the UN expert on torture says has been psychologically tortured, right? Who's been kept there arbitrarily for years. Work in one of your specialties as a journalist is to focus on mental health, right? You don't see sort of a contradiction there. So, yeah, the fact that she deleted it, right, just goes to show how much so many of us, I think we are all in to greater or lesser extents in our own bubbles, right? And we don't necessarily know how it is people beyond our own circle think about certain subjects, or we'll have a very sort of black and white understanding of that. So it's, the Guardian has been at the forefront of attacking WikiLeaks and attacking Assange, even though, of course, they published a great amount of material from there, of sort of jumping on the anti-Assange bandwagon. There are people there who are part of the sort of Russiagate narrative that have alleged that of strong links between Assange and the Russian state without actually providing any evidence. If I were to allege strong links between somebody and the CIA, I think people would expect something to back that up. The same requirement doesn't seem to be there in certain cases. So yeah, people are influenced by that. Other journalists are human beings and they're influenced by propaganda and smearing as much as anybody else. I would say, if anything, Chomsky has made this point, right? So did Edward S. Herman, right? And others, obviously, which is that there's certain within capitalist democracies, if you want to call them that, or bourgeois democracies, representative states, the system is not designed for the majority of the population to be involved in the system, right? It can't actually handle that the way it's constructed. So the majority of people should be focusing on sports or entertainment or whatever, and a minority of people who are, you know, go to university and get certain types of professional jobs are the ones who are to shape policy. And so they're the ones for whom it is most important to be indoctrinated, and they're the ones for whom it is most important that propaganda is targeted against, right? Because they're the ones who will ultimately shape or help to shape one way or another policy, societal policy. And journalism is obviously one of those categories, because what journalists write influence what people think and what people know about subjects. So, yeah.
I think too, with that tweet, you know, and it being deleted, it's such a stark contrast from what, you know, what is needed, which is like, for instance, Nils Meltzer, who also was mistaken about Assange, but who instead took a different path, you know, rather than, you know, he took the path of, well, let's find the truth. And you know what? I was wrong. So I'm going to admit that I was wrong. And it would just be so nice to see that, instead of just a deleted tweet and somewhat shame, or if not even that, just maybe not even wanting to deal with the responses she was getting, rather than just say, you know, this was out of line. You know, it's not like she would have had to fully go to the other side just to say, okay, this was out of line, but instead just let's delete it, you know?
Yeah. Whoops.
God damn it, that was dead air. Josh always yells at us when we have dead air. You guys can't hear Sleepy Josh yell at us. Josh yells at us when we have dead air. And real quick.
So I just real quick.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, anyone who's watching or listening right now, I'm not going to tell you to be vicious to Hannah Parkinson, but you can certainly drive by her Twitter account and let her know that for a mental health professional to vomit over a picture of a man holding his baby is a little freaking weird.
But no,
Yes.
like, I don't see how she can even call herself a journalist and then release something like that. Like, at the very pinnacle of all of it, like, this person obviously knows this situation, at least to a minor extent, and understands that this person also did her job. So
Well,
yeah.
No, I was thinking that's the same point that Muhammad was making about, you know, that 20% intelligentsia class. Like Chomsky talks about a little, you know, that in Manufacturing Consent, that's just, you know, this world that's believing all this propaganda. So in her mind, you know, a journalist would that's the correct response. You know what I mean? That we know that WikiLeaks we know that Julian Assange is, you know, a bad guy, or, you know, a cat abuser or whatever. So this picture of him holding the baby can't possibly be true. You know what I mean? Like, it's that kind of violent reaction to things like that, because in her mind she has a lot of premises that are false, you know, so an inability to even react properly to something like that.
Yeah, so trying to get better media coverage is actually part of what we have going on right now for the actions for this week. I've been dropping it in the Restream chat, but basically every week now we're going to be putting out a different set of like 3 to 5 actions for people to take. This week it was contacting media outlets for better coverage, supporting journalists and activists that have been targeted themselves, and also signing and sharing petitions. So if you could, I just put that in the chat a couple minutes ago. It's still sitting up there. I'll drop the link in again, but please take the time to share these, and we'll have a whole new set of actions up for when we kick off tomorrow.
And I think at this point, it's a good time to introduce the labor leaks and start running through them. Mo, if you could kind of give us a backdrop of what the labor leaks are, and then we'll start diving into the material and some of the relevant articles that summarize them pretty well.
Okay, so the Equality and Human Rights Commission was asked, was being pushed. I don't know if we even know officially who it was that had asked them to, but to investigate the Labour Party under allegations of anti-Semitism. And so an internal investigation within the Labour Party was commissioned, which looked at a particular time period, which was actually a couple of years ago, looked at specifically the unit that was supposed to deal with complaints into anti-Semitism. But it also ended up looking at other issues, supposed so-called factionalism within the Labour Party at that time. And by my estimation, it does two main things, although it is an 851-page report. So, you know, we might be able to discuss some key aspects of it, but there's a lot in there. And obviously, there's lots of repetition, as you'd imagine, for a report like this. People can find it still online, and there are lots of articles which look at various aspects of it. But within it, so the two main things, if I could broadly describe them as it reveals that there was active sabotage of the left, of the pro-Corbyn elements within the party, and of the party itself, deliberate sabotage of the party's chances in the general election in 2017. And second, it unfortunately nonetheless reinforces some of the same by claiming certain things and as being anti-Semitic. So there are people who were suspended under the sort of a veil of vague accusations of anti-Semitism, a number of them who were themselves Jewish, and they're actually nonetheless referred to in this report, and it just sort of takes it for granted. You know, just sort of like one of those things might be that, you know, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, for example. It doesn't explicitly state that as far as I'm aware, but it does put that into the kind of, there's the general kind of vibe. So that would be the negative thing that it does. The positive thing that it does is it reveals, I mean, I'd said this before, but it bears repeating because this is probably where the focus will probably likely be of our discussion. Active sabotage of the party's chances of winning, deliberate, willful active sabotage by elements within the political party, both unelected within the bureaucracy, allied with elected members of the party, to prevent the Labour Party from winning the general election in 2017. Labour lost by like 2,250 votes. It lost the ability to win a majority. So we live in a parliamentary system here where if a political party wins enough seats throughout, enough parliamentary seats, then the political party which has a majority of seats in the Houses of Parliament is then asked by the Queen to form a government, to form, you know, to take on the executive branch of government, as it were. They nonetheless did well enough that they took away the Tory party's majority. So if you're following the press, lots of the press sought to downplay how well Labour did. It actually did very well. And even in the report, we see WhatsApp messages and emails between members of the bureaucracy being quite despondent of the fact that despite their efforts to deliver a humiliating defeat for Corbyn, which is what they wanted, a humiliating defeat, so that their preferred candidates could then replace Corbyn as leader, they were quite unhappy that people were nonetheless. Labour saw some of the biggest gains it had made in many years. So yeah, it's on a certain level not surprising, although I have to say I'm still surprised by the brazen nature of it, you know, so which is good that I can still be surprised, but it is definitely shocking. You know, there's that expression, the phrase shocking but not surprising. I would say it's still a bit surprising, but it's definitely outrageous. I wonder if there are elements of crime there in terms of frauds. You know, people are taking, in some cases, being paid £100,000 to aid in the election and the electoral success of a party, when you see that big chunks of them are actively sabotaging and even funneling money away from candidates towards very safe seats that would win by very large majorities, that have historically safe for Labour, and who were centre-right, who were on the right end of the party. So it's active sabotage by the right wing of the Labour Party because they're anti-left and anti-Corbyn. So that's a key.
If it's anything like we've seen in the U.S., when the Guccifer 2 leaks and the leaks about from the DNC leaks from WikiLeaks came out, Jared and Elizabeth Beck did a class action fraud lawsuit against the DNC for it. And it forced the DNC to argue in court that they are a private corporation, that they are beholden to no one. So it would be interesting, because I'm assuming there will be lawsuits that come from this, to see what ends up happening with that, if they're going to make similar arguments, or if there's even anyone in a position to file a lawsuit about fraud, like you were saying with this at all.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I mean, I was following that case as it happened, the DNC lawsuit, the lawsuit against the DNC, including when it first came out, where he said, I think one of the lawyers said, look, you know, we could make a decision, my clients, I don't know if he said we or my clients, but basically speaking about the DNC, you know, in smoke-filled rooms, something like that. Didn't he say, he'd talk about with cigars and smoke-filled rooms, we could decide on our own who the candidate is going to be. It's up to us, really. It's like we don't even have to follow our own rules of what we state in terms of neutrality. It will be interesting. I would put it this way: there have been, I know the judge threw out the case on the basis that this is a political matter, right? And that people need to, it's a political matter, so that people need to work within the party, or make use of the complaints regime or whatever it is within the DNC, which is of course a joke, when the point is that the regime itself is rigged in violation of its apparent rules. I have seen a number of lawsuits here challenging the Labour Party bureaucracy, including some of them which were successful. One by former MP Chris Williamson, was his suspension from the party. And they didn't say, oh, this is, the judge in that case in the High Court didn't say, oh, this is a political decision, so therefore it's outside of my scope. He ended up ruling that his suspension was unlawful. So I think there is definitely scope for, if there are people who have money, because it's expensive. And in this country, especially since certain reforms, if you want to call them that, or possibly deforms, depending on how you look at it, were done, you are potentially on the hook for not only your costs, but the legal costs of the other side if you lose, right? So the system in that respect is more favorable to a party of a lawsuit which has plenty of money, because if you lose and you've already got plenty of money, well, that's, you know, you've got plenty of money. If you don't have plenty of money and you lose, that means you end up having to pay the legal costs of the other side, and that's could mean you're paying tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of pounds. So that is a factor which have to be figured in, right, when people decide whether to sue. There is talk of a lawsuit right now, by the way, against the Labour Party as a result of these leaks. But the lawsuit is being brought by people who are named in the report as being among those engaged in sabotage, right? So it's like a data protection violation lawsuit. Like, you violated our data by allowing this report to be leaked, which is interesting because this report should have been made public anyway. You know what I mean? It's an official report. And if it shows you as being engaged in any kind of fraud, whether it's a crime or it's in a gray area as to whether or not it's a crime, that's in the public interest. So we'll see how well the Labour Party actually defends itself for this lawsuit, now that Keir Starmer, who's more from the right of the party, if you like, of the Blairite wing of the party, is now the leadership. You know, who knows, who knows, they might just decide to settle it or whatever. But there is a lawsuit right now.
Let's talk for a moment about who Keir Starmer is. He's a solicitor. He's an attorney. He worked out of the Crown Prosecutorial Office at one point.
A barrister. He died. He was chief prosecutor, so he didn't. Yeah, so he didn't make his way up the ranks. He was appointed chief prosecutor,
and he was involved with the prosecutorial service when they were putting pressure on the Swedish police to go after Julian Assange. That the emails that were in the Nils Melzer interview in the Republic, where the UK is telling Sweden, don't get cold feet, keep going after this guy. That was during Sir Keir's tenure, his time with prosecutorial service there. This is you're right, this is a right-wing Blairite who, through, as the report shows, several years of attacking the left of the left faction of Labor has now positioned himself, to lead this party into a direction that would make Margaret Thatcher proud. Which, by the way, my favorite Margaret Thatcher quote ever. A BBC reporter asked her what her most memorable achievement was as prime minister, and Thatcher gets this little grin on her face, and she says, "Tony Blair and New Labour was her crowning achievement as prime minister."
So, Mo,
sink in a little bit.
Quick question about the lawsuit. Since it is members whose names were essentially put out in this that are suing the party because they feel like it shouldn't have been put out, is it going to also be members of that same faction that were trying to stop Jeremy Corbyn that are going to be responsible for taking this to court on Labor's side, or have they developed some kind of way to separate the two so it's not the anti-Corbyn wing suing and the anti-Corbyn wing being sued, so to speak?
That's an interesting question. I suppose I'll have to speak to some people who'd be more in the know about that. I mean, I imagine there would be consultation with, but once again, I don't know, but I imagine there would be consultation with the leading figures of the Labour Party in terms of what's going on with the lawsuit. There are a number of people who were there in 2017 that are covered in the report who aren't in the positions of power now currently. They work somewhere else, or they left the Labour Party bureaucracy. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how. I mean, the lawsuit has been announced, but it's only recently been announced. This report was only recently leaked. So it'll be interesting to see how it develops. The short answer is I don't know. Although I was myself wondering how you'll end up having the. I mean, bear in mind there were there's the pro-Corbyn and the anti-Corbyn faction within the bureaucracy, where the bureaucracy was clearly, the majority of it was not pro-Corbyn. The majority of the membership was, right, because he was elected by a large margin. But the bureaucracy precedes him by quite some time, by many years, by decades, right? And part of what New Labour did when Tony Blair, that you mentioned earlier, that Steve mentioned earlier, part of them taking over the Labour Party was the purging of leftist elements throughout the party, throughout the structure, right? So
yeah, this is discussed pretty extensively in the leaked report. The amount of new people who came into the Labor, they're referred to as either like Greens or communists or Trotskyists, and a slew of much more negative terminology that's being used throughout this report. Josh, if you could please pull the Sky News article that along with Novara Media, these two outlets basically broke their report, and I want to kind of go through their bullet points real quick as to what they were talking about. But to set it up, the investigation, which was completed in the last month of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, claims to have found no evidence of anti-Semitism complaints being treated differently to other forms of complaint, or of current or former staff being motivated by anti-Semitic intent. What that basically means is they're sort of trying to sweep this under the rug. Let's go down. However, Sky News understands party leaders have told General Secretary Jenny Formby the report entitled "The Work of Labour Party's Governance and Legal Unit in Relation to Anti-Semitism 2014 to 2019 should not be submitted to the commission due to fears it could damage the party's wider case." Of course it would, because contained within it are conversations in 2017, which appear to show senior staff preparing for Tom Watson to become interim leader in anticipation of Mr. Corbyn losing the election. Conversations which it is claimed show senior staff hid information from the leader's office about digital spending and contact details for MPs and candidates during the election. Conversations on election night in which members of the group talk about the need to hide their disappointment that Mr. Corbyn had done better than expected and would be unlikely to resign. Discussion about whether the grassroots activist network Momentum could be proscribed for being a party within a party. Scrolling down here a little bit. Conversations between senior staff in Lord McNichol's office in which they refer to former director of communications Seamus Milne as Dracula and saying he was spiteful and evil and we should make sure he's never allowed in our party if it's the last thing we do. They refer to Corbyn's former chief of staff Carrie Murphy as Medusa and a crazy woman and a bitch-faced cow that would make a good dartboard. The fuck?
These are all the liberal centrists, by the way. These are all the people. They're like our version of your Clintonites and Joe Bidenites. And,
yeah. They're the people
and the near Tandons, and they're the centrist, sort of like third way liberal, sort of corporate Democrat, but also just people who they're not left, even though the Labour Party is, originally has its origins among people who were genuine socialists, as well as people who are, shall we say, left nationalists and elements of business and what have you. These people are not, they're much, they are very much of the like centrist corporate view. And they have real foul mouths, actually, the way they speak.
And they're the people who are the first ones to tone police the left or tone police anyone else. And to sit there and be like, we demand civility and unity in this moment.
That's true. And one of the other things the report shows is that because of their obsession with
Do we lose you, Mo?
I think we lost him.
Mo, if we lost you, please jump back in. I'm gonna go back to this thing here real quick. Responding to messages cited and the allegations made against him in the report, Lord McNichol said the energy and effort that must have been invested in trawling 10,000 emails rather than challenging anti-Semitism in the party is troubling. So fuck this guy, really, because the weaponization of the term anti-Semitism over the last several years is a deliberate operation that the Lib Dems, the right-leaning Labor people, Tories, and in this country, establishment Democrats and to an extent Republicans have implemented in order to silence real and accurate information about what goes on in the ideology of the political movement of Zionism. Zionism is not Judaism. Zionism is not, it is a political ideology with a very long history that began before the state of Israel was established. So for this to become weaponized and for this to be used to oust Chris Williamson, to try and kill the candidacy of Jeremy Corbyn, which it apparently successfully has not once but twice, that weaponization of anti-Semitism is just ghastly, I guess.
And it shows the parallels between the so-called liberal political parties here in the US and over in the UK about how it isn't about policy, it isn't about people, it isn't about democracy, it is about continuing the legacy built by establishment and pre-existing governmental power, to where in the labor leaks, it literally shows us the same way that the DNC leak shows us that it's about preserving the power of the establishment and curtailing any voices that may speak out otherwise. And
That's
not even that. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's so true, Andrew, because I think one of the things that stood out to me, just to bring home that point, is the comment, and I can't remember who it was that said it in here. I'm sure we'll go over it, but the people have spoken, bastards.
Yeah, that's right.
It just shows that's, it's like they've completely lost sight of what the purpose is of any party at all in the first place,
Well,
which is to represent the people.
Well, can I? The one point I would disagree with, because I would agree that it shows very much how power structures exist to perpetuate those which created them or which have fully kind of taken them over, right? So that's absolutely true. The one thing I would say when we say it's not about policy, I would say it is, in the sense that these people genuinely, just as there are those of us who generally maybe, I don't know, are generally right-wing libertarian or generally on the left, or what, have those genuinely held beliefs, genuinely socialist and where the direction they think that the world needs to get towards, etc. There are those who genuinely disagree with those as well and generally hold their beliefs. So neoliberalism isn't like a fake thing. It is, or liberalism. They genuinely do oppose left-wing policies. So there are people who will call themselves, and this has been the case for even 100 years, who will call themselves socialists, who actually promote nothing more than social democratic policies, although even now, what's been promoted are social democratic policies, which are just on the left end of the liberal spectrum. And that is just seen as way too much for these people because the time has moved on. They're of the neoliberal era. So the thing is, they are actively campaigning for for the class interests and the ideological interests that they support, and therefore undermining it doesn't matter that people were quote unquote democratically elected. I think one thing that it shows is that the notion of democracy in that sense, or even of just representative democracy, because it's not actual democracy, of representative elections and what have you, that is always, there's nothing new about this. I think if we could see the equivalent of WhatsApp messages and what have you, or conversations from 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it'd be the same thing, right? Is that it should help to expose for all of us the extent to which there isn't a completely neutral bureaucracy, whether we're talking about the state structure itself, whether we're talking about a corporation, or whether we're talking about within a political party, right? Because that would imply that all these people believe in absolutely nothing. Because if they believed in absolutely nothing, right, then they would go along with the policies of whoever was elected, right? Because no skin off their nose. They do believe in something. It's just a different direction. It's a right wing from the elected leader. So they don't believe in democracy.
It's hard to tell if they truly believe in the neoliberal ideology and the espousing of free market uber alles, or if they're just soulless fucking empty suits following orders. Like the demarcation between the two is incredibly thin.
But many of them are high-ranking, so there's no one there. It doesn't appear that they're following orders from anybody, in the sense that, like, many of them are literally high-ranking members of the bureaucracy. Former head. Here's one example. So you'll be able to appreciate. Not that you couldn't appreciate the others. I mean, to Americanize it almost, right? So John Stolliday at the time was director of governance and legal of the governance and legal unit. And he now works at Unison, which is a union, one of the largest unions in the country. There's emails or WhatsApp messages where he discusses replacing the one person, one vote system, which Labour has currently, and which is what resulted in Corbyn winning twice by large margins, right? Because it didn't used to have one person, one vote. It was changed. In fact, the right wing of the party pressurized the previous leader, Ed Miliband, to change it to one. Like, there's media pressure as well for him to change it, because the unions used to have a large size role in deciding who the leader is of the Labour Party, right? Which makes sense, since it was a Labour Party and unions literally were directly involved in the creation of this party. But because of union membership has gone down, the weakening of labor unions, especially since Thatcher years, etc., it made it easier for the more liberal faction to be like, hey, it's not fair for the unions to have this outsized role, right? So they thought that this will be the death knell of the left, right? So this will be once and for all, we'll make it one person, one vote. They were shocked how popular Corbyn's proposed policies were that resulted in him getting elected. So John Stolliday proposed a return to the electoral college system, as known as electoral college rule change, which you'll be able to appreciate because you have an electoral college in your country, right? So to move away from a popular one person, one vote towards an electoral college system. And this is the head of the legal department. This is the director of it. of the Labour Party bureaucracy. So it's like, I suppose, from our perspective, they're soulless. From their perspective, the status quo is just fine. It'd just be better if they were in charge rather than the Tory party in charge. You know what I mean? Like, the main problem is that we need to get back into government, but with our views, right? Not with core, because otherwise, what would be their problem? Why would they be so actively campaigning to sabotage the left? Right, in the party, they're actively campaigning because they do not support those policies. They don't support nationalization of the railways. They don't support a shift in his foreign policy objectives, right? And for different ones of them, it'll be different issues. Everybody on to the left of Gordon Brown is smeared as a trot, right? If you're not Gordon Brown, who's basically a neoliberal as well, he was to the left of Blair, but that doesn't mean anything. You know what I mean? He represented, like, he was supposedly opposed to the Iraq War. Right, and his faction within the Labour Party that supported him also opposed the invasion of Iraq. But he stayed as chancellor, right? He could have resigned. That would be a big deal. The second most powerful position in government resigns with the Iraq War. He obviously wanted to be prime minister more than he opposed the invasion of Iraq, so he stayed on. So it really does give you insight into how naive it is to think that, or whatever term you want to use, to think that a system which has been designed within a certain political, social, and economic model, that it will exist to support anybody. And I think there are lessons to take from this for the wider political system as well. This is a specific type of left critique of electoral politics, but the electoral system itself is not designed to be democratic, right? It's designed, it was designed and chosen and evolved within certain political, social, and economic systems. So feudal, and then proto-capitalist, and then capitalist, right? It was not designed to give voice to the vast majority of people to actually change, not just give voice, but actually shape policy. And I think part of the issues that people have to see is the extent to which we can just wait and depend on the right politicians to take over government, and then once they win, because I spoke to MPs about this, like lefty MPs on Labour, when it still looked they might win, and I said, how much discussion are you guys having about how difficult it's going to be to govern, even if you win in a majority, right? Like the idea that the bureaucracy is just going to sit there and take your commands, right? That the intelligence services, that the military bureaucracy, that, there's an excellent article written in Declassified, you guys should check out, where it talks about how there was active sabotage of Labour, active collusion with the press and the ranking members of the British military constantly leaking, British military and the intelligence services constantly leaking against Jeremy Corbyn, constantly. Right, these are the kinds of things that, like, in theory, a liberal democratic state shouldn't be allowed because the military is supposed to be neutral. But that's, he's much closer to power than, say, Sanders, right? Because he's actually the head of a party in a parliamentary system, and all it takes is to win a majority, and then you're in government. But one thing I was arguing, the point is, I put this to these MPs, and they were saying not at all. I was like, capital strikes, finance capital goes on strike, they start transferring money out of the country, you start having sabotage of the economic system by the capitalist class like you do everywhere else, historically, like we saw in Venezuela as well. How much are you guys preparing for this reality that you're not going to have the police force, the military, and chunks of the civil service bureaucracy on your side? And it was literally not at all. These aren't discussions that are being had. Because I suppose if you're going to be a member of parliament for a long time, you have to believe in the system. And Corbyn is a believer in the system, right? That it is possible to achieve socialism through electoral politics. I leave it to our viewers to determine on their own whether or not they think it is realistic.
I have a question for you. How do you think that now this, this right-wing faction in the Labour Party that's moved, what are their main differences then with the Tories? What do they still disagree on?
It's about degrees, right? So the interesting question about that is, especially if we're moving a bit away from the era of austerity, we're experiencing a bit of red Tory policies as they're known, whereas in order to avoid losing to Labour, you end up implementing some elements of a sort of a social democratic policies in order to win over working class areas and what have you that should otherwise despise you and historically have. The difference
That's actually
is,
something we're seeing here in the U.S. too. That political shift where you have Donald Trump now expanding Medicare to cover anyone who gets affected with coronavirus, and you also have the very faint beginnings of a universal basic income coming in with people are calling them their Trump checks, the $1,200 that are going out. And even as far as the payroll protection program for small businesses, where those aren't policies that were championed by the left-wing so-called socialist elements of the American political process, where it was the right wing that fit those in, while the left wing was giving out trillions of dollars to banking institutions.
yeah, so over here you have strong links between the Blairite wing of the Labour Party and finance capital, but then again, those links have always existed with the Tory party as well. So the differences will be of degree. Part of it is that pressure within the Labour Party can mean that you can get better things on, you could bring an end probably to cuts on like social welfare programs, because there's just been horrendous level of cuts to our programs, which provide support for people who have disabilities and people who are incredibly poor, who despite working can't even pay rent. I mean, it's just obscene how much of your salary ends up going to rent here. Vacation is not just a problem for parts of London. It's like, practically part of the country. The idea that you end up to 50% of your salary easily on paying rent, right, is mad. And where most people do not earn that much. So, it's because of the fact that the Labour has unions and still has, like, within its bloc, and still has to cater towards certain parts of the country, of its membership. I would say that let's say Keir Starmer were to become prime minister, you'd probably see an end to, although we may be seeing an end to austerity anyway, right? That has run its course. But you'd probably see an end to austerity. You'd probably see an end to all the cuts to various welfare benefits. One report, which has been peer-reviewed as far as I'm aware, came out a couple of years ago, argued, and this is in either the Lancet Medical Journal or the British Medical Journal, I can't remember which one, that there are 120,000 excess deaths as a result of the implementation of austerity. So that's human beings who would otherwise still be alive, at the time of writing the report, who have died. And that is a hell of a lot of structural violence that we're talking about, because it's not like they're arguing that people from the Department of Health are going around shooting people in the face. This is that, right? So this is that you're cutting back so much that support that people would otherwise aren't getting. So piling on anxiety and stress and lack of medical support and fear and loss of income and what have you, literally putting people in an early grave. And of course that affects the poorest, the most vulnerable, the most, right? And this is spread out across the kingdom, mind you. That's a lot of people to be killed as a result of policies, which we know historically do that anyway. If you look at post-Soviet Russia, if you look at Eastern Europe, when these policies, which weren't called austerity back then, they were called structural adjustment programs, pushed by the IMF and backed by the United States and Britain, which is privatize everything, right? You eliminate any kind of social welfare programs, privatize the healthcare system, privatize lots of public assets. These shock doctrine policies, as they were called, shock therapy, the faster you do it, the higher the death toll. And you actually saw a massive decline in the male rates of longevity, like a statistically significant decline in Ukraine and other parts of Russia, and it's been seen elsewhere. So it's not like we didn't know what austerity does. And it wasn't called austerity then here, but it's the same policies, right? You privatize public assets and you cut down on social welfare programs. So we'll probably see a curtailing of that. But it is an excellent question, especially now as we're hearing that Keir Starmer is, he's announced himself as being unequivocally supporting of Zionism, right? So that is a signal now that whatever criticisms and pushing away from the pro-Israeli position of the Labour Party is now shifting back to that. He also appears to be coming on the side of not criticizing India for its actions in Kashmir, despite a vote in conference to do precisely that, saying it's up for them to deal with. I don't know if you know, like, historically what's been going on there between Pakistan, India, and Kashmir. And so, yeah, he does seem to be trying to take things back to the direction of where things were under Blair. But like I said, so that makes it, what's the difference between him and then the Tories? Well, you could argue the same thing with the Republicans and the Democrats. It's a matter of degree. The one thing that we don't have as much is that with the Republicans in the United States, you have explicit anti-science positions, not just on climate change, but on anything, on loads of things. And they're much more socially reactionary on a woman's right to control her own body and a right to have an abortion and things like that, access to contraception. You don't really have that here within England and Wales, within the right-wing party. I mean, it was David Cameron as Prime Minister who oversaw shifting from the right to have civil unions in same-sex marriages to just completely saying that marriage is between either a man or a woman or a member of the same sex. So it's the right-wing party that did that here. Right, so there's more similarities, even I would say, between the right of the Democratic Party and the Tories than there are between the right of the Labour Party and the Tories than there is between the right of the American Democratic Party and the Republicans, because we don't have. Yeah, if that makes sense.
This conversation, because you this morning you had sent me a number of articles out of the Tribune magazine, and one of them is the Blairite roots in the leaked labor reports. If we could get that on the screen, we can kind of go through just a little bit of it to underscore what we're talking about. And then I would like to pull up a couple of the screenshots of the labor leaks, and I will then share from that 851 page document, a handful of pages. Are we up, Josh? Awesome, thank you. The 2017 manifesto contained a swath of broadly social demographic policies that many in the party were surprised to learn were extremely popular with the electorate, because, as we've discussed, these people kind of live in their own neoliberal bubble, and the thoughts of the peasantry don't necessarily seep into their realm. Nationalizing the railways, raising taxes on the wealthy, and the abolition of tuition fees were all policies that struck a chord with voters more used to hearing politicians battle it out during election time over which version of austerity to implement. Its senior members of the staff reacted to the manifesto with utter horror. A WhatsApp exchange detailed in the report shows staffers reacting to John McDonnell's announcement of an increase in corporation tax by exclaiming that they can't quite believe it. Responding to the announcement of public ownership of rail, another said such policies look like Trots doing what Trots do. Aside from their apparent misunderstanding of the nature of Trotskyism, such statements suggest that the party's anti-socialists hold views that place them not simply to the right of most members of the Labour Party, but also to the right of most of the electorate. The question then presents itself, what are these people doing in the Labour Party at all? And this is where the exploration of the Blairite roots of this come into play. But I think this kicks off a larger discussion, a larger question with the reality that in the Five Eyes countries, particularly, but certainly, globally as well, the disconnect between the people who are in positions of perceived or real power and the electorate, or the rabble, me, it is so overwhelmingly stark that you have to question the legitimacy of the electoral system as an entity, as a whole. And I think that two clearly rigged elections here in the US, back-to-back presidential elections, a 2017 labor election where the party tried everything they could to sabotage the candidate and then wound up succeeding in 2019, along with ousting Chris Williamson. There are people questioning the legitimacy of the system in the UK. Is it just factions of the left, or is this sort of become a public discussion?
So I can't. So I'll just say what it is that I've come across, but bear in mind, for me to give a proper perspective on that would require like a kind of census-like research, which I can't claim to have done. You know, it's interesting. You mentioned Chris Williamson. He is working on developing sort of his own like a movement, a movement that is not linked to a political party and it's not linked to the Labour Party. And this is a guy who's been a member of the Labour Party for 44 years, right? You know what I mean? So he obviously believed in the system for many years. And he wrote an article, I think it was it published in the Morning Star, which explicitly said, you know, talks about the sort of limitations of so-called representative democracy or electoral politics, and talks about the need to develop movements and organizations outside of that system to be able to push for change. So there are definitely, I think there's definitely appetite. There probably will always have been appetite. It just goes up and down depending on what's going on, right, around you. So in that respect, I have seen people questioning the legitimacy of the system. But, you know, the old saying, does it come from Orwell? Those who control the past control the future, and those who control the present control the past, right? So what do you think about what's possible is quite often determined by what you know about your own history or about our history as human beings, right? So when I try not to do it too often, but you know, when I'm in discussions, I'll quite often end up saying, you know, representative democracy it's sort of a con, the term, even representative democracy, like 150 years ago, nobody would have used it, right? So the idea that a republic, some kind of representative democracy, would have been scoffed at, would have been laughed at. And same thing, the idea that Britain was a democracy would have been laughed at. A democracy is what we could refer to as being a direct democracy. Today, that's the term we use, right? Where where chunks of everyday people would be directly involved in having a say. Whereas a system where you elect somebody who then has, officially speaking at least, the power to decide policy and do anything about it once they're elected, that is by its very nature and its design oligarchical. It's not democratic. So you cannot have a representative democracy in that sense, right? And that's by design. You could have a delegate-based system like they have in Rojava in northeast Syria, where people who are elected are delegates, they're not representatives. So if they end up voting on a policy with the other delegates that violates the what you've granted them, their community has told them that they can do, that policy just gets reversed, right? Because they're a delegate, they're not allowed to do that. And it does happen sometimes, right? Where you've exceeded your mandate. That's not the case with a representative. I could tell you that I guarantee and swear on my soul that I will vote in favor or against a bill, and then I get elected and I vote in favor of it, and there's nothing you can do about it unless you're going to vote against me in the next election, right? And we're told that's representative democracy. So yeah, there are people who do question that. The point is, how do you, on the one hand, how do you take disenchantment with the system, but then turn that towards productive means? Because you can have loads of people saying the system is bullshit. People have been saying that for years. You know, when Tony Blair won, I don't think you had millions of people who didn't vote, right? And you still have millions upon millions of people who don't vote, right? So it's people becoming disillusioned can also just turn into them being disaffected and saying they're all the same, there's nothing we can do, and then people just leave the party. And I don't think people like Keir Starmer have a problem with the fact that people are now leaving the party because they're disillusioned. You know what I mean? They want people to leave the party. They find those people to be a pain in the ass. So, you know.
There's a couple of sections in that leaked report that talk about like lower membership does us better.
Yeah, and I think we've seen the same thing with the Democratic Party, right? Which is low voter turnout is shown to be better for the Republicans generally. Medium voter turnout is seen as being better for the sort of centrist Democratic Party candidate, and the highest level turnout is associated with doing better for candidates who are at least perceived to be most on the left of those options, right? Yeah, it's the same thing here. Social democratic policies, when they're polled, when you don't associate them with anybody, and you just say, "What do you think of these policies?" Whatever you and I may think about them, when they're polled, they're very, very popular across the board, across demographic groups and people. It doesn't matter if you call yourself a conservative or what have you. When you say, "What do you think about just straight up nationalization," without talking about democratizing the institutions, what have you, you just say, nationalizing the railways, nationalizing the telecom industry, nationalizing the weapons manufacturing industry, nationalizing utilities industry, nationalizing all these various services. We're talking about 60, 70, 80% approval rating in the country. I saw a report by the Legatum Institute, which is like a market fundamentalist, everything should be private institute, right? One of those sort of, private is always better, right? Very free market oriented. And they did their own research survey. And that's what they found as well. This came out a couple of years ago, I think 2017, because they, whatever they may say publicly, right? The capitalist class need to be sort of informed about what the hell's going on in the country, right? So there are people who serve those interests. And the research they showed was consistently that in this country, at least, terms like socialism tend to be more associated with, more positive views. Terms like capitalism, more associated, less positive views, although more associated with terms like innovation, but also greed and selfishness. And overall, the population across age groups and across the country support the kinds of, the way they polled it, they didn't say, "What do you think about democratizing institutions so that they're controlled by the workers and then sort of working in tandem with the government to provide a post-capitalist system," right? They don't ask that. They just say straight up, "What do you think about these things being nationalized?" And the responses are overwhelming. So yeah, that's one of the things they discovered, is that the more people are involved, the more to the left the policies are likely to be. So that being said, I don't know that I would have what it takes to persevere within a political structure that is by its design there to prevent the types of policies that I support getting through. I think it takes a very special kind of person. I'm glad there are others who are still working at it. But I think putting your hopes in a political party, hopefully more people are seeing that that's not the way to go. That, yeah, okay, it's great, but we need that avenue, because that's one avenue you have to take, but that it's not that all our work and research needs to be connected to a political party, and that when you lose an election, well, that's it then. There's nothing for us to do for the next 4 years other than hope to work to win the next election. I think that it's ahistorical to see prior successes, if you think social democratic reforms are successes, to see them as being purely coming from political parties. They came because of mass pushes from the economy itself, right? From mobilization and organization from the population, right? It's not that they're just elites on their own in a vacuum just deciding that it'd be better to raise taxes on the rich to pay for services for the poor. It's that there was genuine fear of revolution at a time where revolutions were happening around the world, that if we don't give them something, we will lose everything. And the same in the United States as it was in Britain. That's where the National Health Service comes from. You have all these people returning who are trained in war and killing and using guns, coming back from war, and all these demands being made, like, perhaps we should just overthrow the system. Well, we have people losing their homes because they can't pay medical bills, etc. You guys, it'll sound familiar for you guys. Well, that's what it used to be like over here. And there was a genuine fear that you have now these millions of people who are trained killers, right? Who might end up mobilizing to overthrow the system. So that's why you had pretty kind of, radical social democratic reforms being implemented as a way of buying off the population. So yeah, it wasn't just some people forming a political party and getting elected. But people, if you're not taught that in school, right? You're taught that there was a need from society. Every now and then you have a demonstration, and then politicians responded to that need, right? I think that's backwards. It's the reverse. It's politicians being pushed and making decisions that they realize that if they don't make those decisions, but in the end it wasn't enough because we've ended up where we are, and most of those social democratic reforms have been undone, and the New Deal practically doesn't exist anymore in the United States, although you have the bureaucracy of it.
Mohammed, I had a question for you. Let's see. In the one article that we had already kind of gone over, Keir Starmer had made the comment, Labour's new right-wing leader on Tuesday announced an investigation into who leaked the document. The content and the release of the report into public domain raise a number of matters of serious concern. Do you think this is just going to be pushed under the rug and, directed towards the leaker and the problems with this document even coming out rather than the issues that have been raised in it?
That's my fear, and that does look like the direction that it's going in. It comes down to how much within the party is still able to push to demand that that's not the direction that it goes in, right? Because there are still elements, whether it's representatives of unions or just other people who are within the bureaucracy who are say more to the left, the ones who wanted to win, if you like, under Corbyn. So even if you weren't to the left, but just say you weren't, you wanted to win because you still thought that it would be better with Corbyn as prime minister than with the Tories being in government. If there's enough pressure, that's what it comes down to, right? So Keir Starmer was director of public prosecutions, and a man named Ian Tomlinson, a news agent, was hit by a police officer with a billy club, or the equivalent, if you like, and he died. He died of a heart attack, and it was caught on camera. And the only reason, I mean, this guy has a background as a human rights barrister, by the way. I should point that out, right? So, and he worked on a number of notable cases, including pro bono on the McLibel case. I don't know if I mentioned with you guys, where McDonald's was suing an activist, a London Greenpeace activist, and a different postman who were handing out flyers about McDonald's. They were saying all this information is defamatory, it's not true. And they were sued by this billion-dollar corporation. And one of the people who, if you guys should watch the documentary, it might be available online, called McLibel. And this went on for years, right? Ended up being a media disaster for McDonald's, right? And one of the people in that documentary that you see at one point, offering advice and assistance to Helen, and I forgot the gentleman's name, was Keir Starmer, right? I'm pretty sure he's even written a book on the Human Rights Act, right? But that was, we're talking about 20 years ago, right? But the point is that he didn't bring an action against the police officer who killed Ian Tomlinson until there was immense pressure to do so, right? Police officers kill people in this country like fairly regularly. Not that it's televised. Most people actually aren't aware of that. Like once a week, somebody here who's unarmed will be killed by police officers. Christ knows how much it would be if they were armed with guns, right? Because most police here aren't armed with guns, although the number of armed police is increasing as the number of unarmed police is decreasing, which is another issue altogether. So what I'm saying is he, like other politicians and politically minded people, because he wasn't a politician at the time, do respond to public pressure. That being said, they did such a lousy job that the guy ended up not getting convicted. So, you could argue they phoned it in, right? But I would say that, I'm not going to repeat myself. I already repeated it 3 times. Yeah. That is the direction it looks like it's going in, whether or not, and it ends up being a complete whitewash and they just focus on the person who leaked the report rather than on the contents of the report, will come down to how much pressure there is from below and within the structure itself to demand some form of accountability. So yeah.
Well, if the DNC leaks were any kind of example, literally they started a new Cold War over it, where they didn't discuss the contents of the leaks. They went after the publication and the journalists that disclosed what the hell was going on behind the scenes. The UK has done a lot of Russiagating in and of itself. It was actually one of the reasons why Julian was silenced back when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy over the poisoning of a former Russian spy, I believe, that didn't actually kill him, if I remember properly.
Oh,
and
yeah,
Julian
yeah.
said something along the lines of, well, maybe it wasn't Russia. And then they cut his internet. But to get back to the point on hand, do you think that there's any type of diversion or movement that they're going to try to make in regards to maybe not necessarily blaming Russia, but just blaming the people and trying to put their heads on a stick for reporting this?
I mean, it does. Well, actually, there's very little. I know you got a reference to Sky News report. There's pretty little. Most reporting in the press, including in the Guardian, has been pretty superficial. It hasn't gone into the details. I don't know how many members of the public, everyday members of the public who consume news, are aware of the fact that a report leaked which shows active sabotage of the Labour Party by the right wing because they did not want the pro-Corbyn elements to win. I don't know if they know that and of the kinds of things being put out there. Most of it is more about the fact that there was a report that was leaked and criticism that the report has been leaked, etc. So we have seen in the past, you know, there were previous documents that were leaked that Jeremy Corbyn referred to, including that were leaked to him or his office, that showed negotiations between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, or at least their administrations, regarding sort of aspects of privatization or further privatization of the National Health Service, something which the Tory party has said that that's not on the table with our trade negotiations with Trump, right? And then you had people coming out with this argument that, oh, this leak was done similar to other Russian leaks. I mean, I don't even know what that means. There's a Russian way of leaking a document. So yeah, I mean, that's a tried and tested method of instead of dealing with the contents of a leaked document, you either attack the messenger or in this case, the alleged conduit, because it was never shown to be the case, right? That Russia was involved with how, and what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to start outing your sources, right? Because the only way you can prove is to be like, well, actually, it was John Smith, who's a member of the Ministry of Health, who leaked this to me, right? If you do that, first of all, nobody will ever leak anything to you ever again. And then you can open this person up to criminal prosecution under the Official Secrets Act, right? So it's, and they know that you won't do that. They know proper people won't do that, won't out their sources. So is it possible? Sure, but it's also just as possible that they just, this is not a news cycle anymore. You know what I mean? We just won't focus on it. It's, there's all kinds of ways that news can censor, and one of them is just or spin things, but it can also just not report. I don't know how much you guys have seen on the subject. You know what I mean? Like when it came out, it was kind of a big deal. There are those, Novara Media, that's a lefty alternative site, right? Other sites that you'll see it mentioned, the World Socialist website, well, the name speaks for itself right there. Like us, other places that I've read stuff about it, the Tribune, right? These are not mainstream establishment sites.
No, it's
yeah.
In my course of trying to pull information on this, I found that I was a little bit surprised because of how massive a revelation or a series of revelations are in these leaks. How few outlets ran with it, and the ones that did were sort of shaming the idea. The mainstream outlets that ran with this, the legacy or whatever media you want to call it, were sort of shaming the so far unnamed leaker for trying to take down labor. It was seen as like an attack on Keir Starmer and his I guess incoming leadership, rather than holy crap, we need to address these problems within the Labour Party.
Yeah, there was much more coverage of the contents of certain DNC leaks in mainstream press in the States during the election than there has been here. You know what I mean? So like things that Hillary Clinton had said in her Goldman Sachs speeches, if I recall correctly, that came from contents of emails. Was that from John Podesta's emails, or was that from DNC leaks? One of the two.
Wait,
I mean,
which specific?
right.
What specifically?
Well, the email, the speeches. So we know lots of what she said in the Goldman Sachs speeches, or Goldman Sachs and other speeches from emails that were either in the Podesta leaks or in the Podesta hack, right? Because that was a hack, right? He was sent an email. He was sent an email with a link, and the head IT person or whatever had said in his response, it was something like, he should have said, "Don't click on this," or "This isn't fine," but had in a typo to Podesta. It came off like, "This is fine. You can click on this," just because he mistyped it, and Podesta ended up clicking on this worm, which ended up leaking his, resulting in, I mean, it just also shows like the level of incompetence. You think that if you're trying to tell somebody, no, this is a virus, do not click on this, you'd make damn sure that you do not make a mistake there. All caps, things like "do not," right? But anyway, so yeah, that came out in one of the leaks, the leak/hack. But that was covered. There were loads of things I saw reading in the Washington Post and the New York Times and even some of the mainstream press. I think they felt they had to, maybe because it was election time period. But you had a lot more coverage of that in the States.
When that broke in 2016, it was just so earth-shattering, and there was so much buildup to it that the legacy media that we have, the Post and the Times and whatnot, was basically cornered into reporting on it. It's not something that they necessarily wanted to do. There's a parallel right now with the Tara Reade rape allegations, sexual assault allegations, where these outlets were basically cornered into reporting on it because of all the noise that had been generated leading up to them being cornered and reporting on it. My neighbor decided to fire up his weed whacker, by the way, in case anybody hears that.
Well, even when the DNC leaks came out, there wasn't it CNN that said, "You cannot read WikiLeaks. This is against the law."
Yeah, I believe that was Chris Cillizza who said that on air. It is against the law to read these. There were a couple other people that tried to pick that up and run with it. And the idea that someone sitting behind a desk at a media outlet can tell you what is and isn't illegal on the internet is ridiculous on its face. But we're through the net neutrality laws, they're killing net neutrality. We're setting the stage for limiting what people can read via ISP, not via U.S. law. I might have lost some people on that one. I don't know. I'll get Ron Placone onto it.
I was about to say, Ron Placone is somebody that I've been watching, who's been, pushing in California, working on the case of net neutrality in the States. Right when you said that, that's hilarious. Because
I had him on.
Well, that shows what bubble we're in.
I'll have to get him back.
So we had a question in the
Chelsea
chat.
Manning's birthday vigil, and that was a great, like freaking 4-hour just love fest. But he hasn't been on the Free Assange vigil since. We should get him back.
Andrew, you were saying
we had a question for you in the chat while we're off topic here a little bit. How notable are the intelligence gathering apparatuses in the UK, like Bluetooth scanners in public spaces? And are there any talks of like airborne drone food delivery services or anything like that?
Well, so there are restrictions in terms of flying drones in this country. There are also restrictions in terms of flying armed drones, but there is a push to get those restrictions lifted, and there's a regulator which is looking at the issue. So people want to know more about that. They should go to Drone Wars UK, who actively campaign on that issue. In terms of like how notable are the intelligence agencies in terms of their gathering methods, I mean, the methods that you've described, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Is it how widespread known among the public that this is what the intelligence agencies can do, or is it what is legal for them to do? So in terms of legality, lots of the things that were revealed by Snowden, including mass surveillance and computer and phone hacking, were explicitly authorized by the Investigatory Powers Act 2016, which was passed after the Snowden revelations, to basically retroactively legalize that which was being done by the GCHQ and some other intelligence agencies. So in terms of like of drones and food deliveries, I don't know where that would be linked with intelligence agencies. Obviously, anything that exists can be used by those who, you know, policing authorities, if they're able to get into a service, right? So you don't need to have like drone food deliveries. I don't know if I know that's a bigger thing with Amazon in the States. I don't know actually how much, to what extent that's been expanded here. There are lots of areas which have banned the use of even forget about armed drones, non-armed drones. So like parks and stuff, it's not legal to just be flying drones. So it's you know, I have seen there. I don't know if you guys saw it a few weeks back. A particular police department was criticized because it was flying a drone, a surveillance drone, in an area where people out in the countryside, where people were walking, right? And they were walking with their dogs, and it filmed that footage and it put it on Twitter. And it was saying, walking with your dog out in the countryside is not an essential reason to be out, right? This is all COVID related stuff. And they were criticized heavily for doing this, because this is like, well, A, it was creepy. B, it wasn't necessarily the law. They weren't making statements of the law. This was like what they wanted out of desire by reflecting ministerial preferences, right? You have a former Supreme Court judge of this country who went to spoke to the BBC, called it shameful, right? But the point is, nobody had said it was illegal, which means that technically it appears, at least on the face of it, and I could be wrong, I hope I'm wrong, what they did wasn't illegal, which was flying, taking surveillance footage of people engaged in walking in the countryside and then publishing that. So something that's not even intelligence agencies doing it. That's just, I think, was it Merseyside Police Force, right? In terms of Bluetooth, I don't know. I am trying to contact an expert, nearly 300 experts from around the world, including at least a dozen from the UK. IT experts, cybersecurity experts, and others have signed an open letter calling for governments and surveillance and tech companies to be very careful with contact tracing apps. They're like, okay, this can be very useful, right? Surveillance is actually historically has been part of dealing with outbreaks, right? But they're saying if you do it wrong, that means it's open to abuse by states, hackers, and organized crime. Right, so governments, organized crime, and hackers. So there's a right way to be doing contact tracing apps and a wrong way to be doing this kind of surveillance. And it comes down to how you design it, whether you use Bluetooth or not, what the algorithm is designed and what structure. Is it open source? Can we look at it, etc. So I'm trying to get an expert on that to speak specifically onto that point. To what extent could something that has been designed to be dealing with, say, COVID, tracking illnesses, be then used to provide other surveillance for other reasons, but also just end up providing intimate personal information that shouldn't be in the hands of anybody, right? So if people want that, I can send you guys the link, and I don't know if you're able to link up to that, because I found the open letter. It's not in a news article. It's on like a Google Doc, if you like. And people can read the critique there, and then they can see the kinds of concerns there that exist.
I would like to first of all give a shout out to Sean O'Brien, who is the Action for Assange's favorite cybersecurity consultant. But he was on my show, Slow News Day, the other day. Maybe it was yesterday. I don't know. It's all starting to blend together now. But he gave an excellent recap of an event that he organized called the Curve Summit, and it deals with digital privacy in the age of COVID surveillance. And it touches on pretty much everything that we've discussed here in the last few minutes. So if you guys can, if you're watching, if you can dedicate an hour or so at some point over the next few days to watch Sean basically lay this out and tell us how we can effectively safeguard ourselves as best as possible, and to the extent to what the relationship between these security companies and government or government agencies are. There was a question in the A4A chat about what policy, are there any policies that coordinate this level of surveillance? And it's much more of a business relationship between the NHS and, in the UK's case specifically, Palantir, for the contact tracing apps and software that's being developed. It's not so much that this happens through a legislative process. It happens, the same way that Bruce Spiva, DNC attorney, said we can pick our candidates in a smoke-filled back room. And that's how these sorts of the surveillance nightmares, shit shows, horror fests are taking part. There's no vote on it. Before we just go completely off topic, I would like to just, if we could, Sleepy Josh, just go to the 2 screen grabs that I put in the show doc, and just kind of highlight how completely fucked Jeremy Corbyn was in this 2017 election. They literally have a section titled "The Coup," and already before Corbyn was elected, the Telegraph had reported that senior figures said there would be a coup against him at some point. And in fact, there was, like, this is just it. The level of intra-party espionage and intra-party sabotage that took place throughout all of this. Senior staff specifically discussed fishing expeditions to identify left-wingers and then search for any abuse from them. Like, this was an operation that took place, and they were using this to purge Labor Party members. If anyone wants to chime in on that, that would be cool.
I mean, I think it's just super, super telling about what happens when you try to challenge any small amount of political power. Like, Jeremy Corbyn was already the leader of the party. He already had support. And then his party decided to just go for his throat. And the fact that they even had investigation or operations specifically about targeting the elements of the party that support him feels really similar to the way that they targeted and outed members of Bernie Sanders's wing of the party during the Unity Conference days, to where they just gave some of them some power and then slowly chipped away more and more and more at that little bulwark that Sanders had built up. So this is something that it just shows the DNC and the Labor Party essentially operate in the same manners from different sides of the ocean.
I think it really does. And one thing that was, striking to me was seeing at least, and I think Muhammad was talking about this earlier too, is people trying to work within this system, with which both Corbyn and Bernie tried to do. And then, I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, Muhammad, too. I know that Corbyn's gotten some criticism for his way of handling the anti-Semitic attacks by trying to, just sort of quell those. And I want to hear what your opinion is on how that was handled.
So I'm saying this from the perspective of somebody who was not at the top of an organization surrounded by people trying to destroy me, right? And actively sabotage. So this is, like we said, had elements of the military, the majority of the press, or certainly the entirety of the mainstream press, including The Guardian, which is historically linked, however superficially, to the Labour Party. Just constant smearing, constant attacks, constant pressure then from even your own allies who have been advising you, right? So it shows the limits of this idea of great man theory, right, of history. That one person on their own and everything just surrounds them. And that's how our films are organized. That's how if you grow up in an individualist society, and I grew up as a very fierce individualist, I read history and I experience things as like it is individuals who do things on their own, as it were. rather than communities and larger organizations who then work together. So that being said, yes, he while he did push back in terms of smears of anti-Semitism, right? He was not strong. He did end up conceding too much, in my opinion. And that's not just my opinion in hindsight, that was at the time as well. Because what ends up happening is people who were consistent, who were consistently supportive of many of his policies, were also consistent in terms of their critique of British foreign policy. And part of that is their critique of Britain's long historical role in supporting the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the formation of the State of Israel, and the arming of the State of Israel and the backing of it in its various wars and oppression of the indigenous Palestinian population. And so he's a long member critique of the State of Israel as well in the British foreign policy, right? So it's not that he doesn't have that internal critique, right? He's a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and a staunch with the Stop the War Committee as well. Stop the War. Oh my God, I've forgotten the next letter, but the Stop the War campaign as well. But yeah, he did. I think he gave up too much ground. He could have quite strongly said, look, anti-Semitism, like all forms of racism, is wrong, but there's absolutely no evidence that it's endemic in the party. Even if we accept just from the complaints themselves, they make up less than 0.1% of the membership. That's something that, by the way, when polls are done, people don't realize that. If you look at the level that it was covered, right, even just from the accusations cover 0.1% of the membership, which had like 500,000 people, 600,000 at one point because of his being elected. Right. And that is that's just assuming that all the allegations are accurate. And I know for a fact that many weren't, because I know people who were accused who were not anti-Semitic at all.
I think the travesty, the real like heartbreak of the Jeremy Corbyn story is that everything that made him popular, his stance on Brexit, his very, very strong labor roots mentality, in order to appease that Lib Dem faction, to make them stop smearing him in public with all of this anti-Semitic garbage and whatnot, he turned away from his stance on Brexit. He turned away from labor unions. He turned away from even criticizing the British government's relationship with Israel. And that effectively made him weak as a fucking newborn kitten in the eyes of the electorate that had got him to where he was in the first place.
Well, I think it was his failure to come out explicitly and back the people who were being attacked, as saying, these people, I've known these people for years, they're not anti-Semites, right? They're being smeared as anti-Semites. Criticism of the State of Israel, criticism of the founding ideology of the State of Israel is not racist, it's not anti-Semitic. And the Board of British Deputies, with all due respect to them, are not supportive of Labour's projects. They have a historical support for apartheid South Africa. So I don't know if you know them. They've sort of self-anointed speakers, representatives of like British Jewry, right? Jewry, Jewry, the British Jewish population, right? But they are reactionary theocrats. Yeah. They're constantly the go-to people by the press. Like, what do you think of Jeremy Corbyn? Is he anti-Semitic? Is criticism of Zionism anti-Semitic? And it's like, well, but they're only going to them and asking, right? There's a long history of anti-Zionism. First, anti-Zionists were Jewish, right?
Right.
First of all, Zionism originates among Christians, and the majority of Zionists are Christian still to this day. There are tens of millions of them, you guys should know, because they're mostly in your country, right? But it originates from this country, it originates from Britain, and then it migrated to the United States. So the majority of Christians the majority of Zionists are Christian, and historically speaking, the majority of Jewish people are not Zionists, right?
No, because again, Zionism is
anti-Zionist
ideology. It's not a religion. It doesn't encompass.
Yeah. Well, it's a nationalist ideology. That's true. Yeah. But it didn't gain popularity among Jewish people, among people who considered themselves to be Jewish. We're talking about even until after the State of Israel was created. So we're talking about the 1967 war, right? And how that was represented, what was happening there. But I mean, religious Jews, liberal Jews, secular left-wing Jews most of them opposed Zionism if they had a policy on it, if they had an explicit policy on it. That started to shift. Norman Finkelstein writes about this in The Holocaust Industry. I think it's The Holocaust Industry where he discusses this, about when it started to become part of the focus of people's minds in the mainstream. So, but over here, you have this group who are the Board of British Deputies, who are like Jewish clergy, if you like. And they're literally, the press would go to them, it's conscious, right? They're going to them saying, what do you think about the issue? And Corbyn could have and should have just said, like, look, with all due respect to their opinion, that's their opinion. But there are, historically speaking, literally what I've just said, right? There were many of the people who've been targeted and smeared and pushed out of the party are left-wing Jews, right? That's one of the things I did an interview with Jackie Walker, who's Black, Jewish, descendant of slaves and slave owners, right? Portuguese slave owner and a Portuguese Jewish slave owner and who married or had sex with, married one of their slaves, right? So like literally this is her ancestry. So there is this mixed sort of ancestry there. And she was heavily smeared and in the end pushed out of the party. But I know other people as well that this was going on, and these people who've known Corbyn for years. So the thing is, when the thing is, he's surrounded by whoever's advising him, right? That's what people have to understand. Like, you understand what pressure you would be under as well if this is the structure of the system that you're dealing with, right? This is not a new party that was fabricated from the ground up, and you're surrounded by those people. Right? You're surrounded by people who are like, and this is something I kept hearing, right? Just shut up for now and wait till we get into power. And this is something people are being told from the top, not say from Corbyn, but from others like Jenny Formby, right? Just keep your mouth shut and wait until we're in power. Of course, the thing is that if you're prepared to sacrifice that much before you've taken power, how much more are you going to prepare to sacrifice when you have actual power, right? The idea that you're going to become more brave when you're in government and now forget about people in your party now that you're surrounded with. Now you're surrounded with by this entire bureaucratic structure that we've discussed. You're even further away from the average person now because you're in government, right? And you're living in the prime minister's residence, et cetera, et cetera. And this is with the types of discussions I was having with some MPs, and I was trying to point out that, like, if you're not prepared to draw a line now, your lines will keep moving until eventually you've compromised so much, you'll first lose the main base that got you where you are, because they'll become so demoralized that, you know what I mean? Because they've been pushed out or demoralized, what have you. And then as you're not implementing the policies that you wanted to implement, you lose even more people. You'll end up implementing sort of milquetoast left liberal policies that don't deal with the structural problems that we have. And then you'll just lose the next election or the one after that, right? You'll just be clinging on to power. So it's a death by 1,000 cuts. So that's my main critique, is that I understand that maybe you have to keep your mouth shut on certain issues, but when there are attacks against people who represent your fiercest, most educated, I don't mean like a university educated, but like battle-hardened, years of experience, kind of educated and committed members, then it's like, who are you going to have left backing you? Generalized, wishy-washy people who know nothing about the real-life experience of the world. I mean, the types of people, just to go back to Jackie Walker for a second, I'll just end on this. When, I saw there's a documentary called Witch Hunt. You guys can watch it, I think for free now, online, which is about the smearing of the anti-racist left. And I wrote an article about the film and linked it to what was going on with the party wider, more generally. So it was about this. It was about how anti-Semitism was being used to smear the left in order to undermine its chances because of its wider program in Britain of what it wants to do. And she talks about how one of the things they were dealing with in the 80s was, combating groups with names like Hitler Was Right. Like that was their name of the organization, who would be working in tandem. That when you'd see them marching, they'd be marching with police officers who are dressed in police uniform. Right? If you want to know the relationship of the police and the right in this country. Yeah, like literally that's the kind of things that people had to deal with. It was more overt in the 80s, right? So these people who have dealt with like flat out like fascists, out and out fascists, who've dealt with, where political correctness as a movement, right, was literally to get to like stop using the N word, right, against people, right, at university, you know, where certain things would become like taboo, because that's what the original political correctness movement, and also what ended up becoming the banning of fascists from advocating fascist policies at universities. And I mean fascists, yeah, because, you know, for reasons of freedom of speech, it wasn't always the case. But it's like when you're being attacked by the police and you're being attacked by fascist gangs, and these people have direct or indirect support of the overall state, that was what safe spaces were about, was so that like black people and Jewish people at universities didn't have to deal with somebody advocating their extermination, right? Now we can argue that how far it's gone now with a completely different kettle of fish, right? Which thankfully I didn't have to deal with when I was at university. But what you guys have got in the States has migrated over here with your microaggression, etc. Right? And I know it comes from like a good place. I don't want to say it doesn't come from a good place, but that has migrated over here. Thank God I didn't have that when I went to universities. There was none of that.
You're microflexing on me, bro.
Yeah, and all of that. Well, you know, but that's where people can sort of, but in a certain sense, where you have such hyper policing of tone and terminology, what ends up happening is that you can't have proper conversations about things. You know, I've had plenty of people who would said like, look, you know, being kicked out of the Labour Party should be the final thing, right? Even the report from Shami Chakrabarti argued that, right? The anti-Semitism report that she did, right? The racism investigation to racism, the Labour Party, which said that like it should not be your first course of action, right? It should be consultation, education. You know, you want to speak with people, right? Because otherwise you end up having a group, an organization is just people you agree with on everything. The reality is people out there have a mix of views, including racist views, or they might use racist language but don't understand why it's problematic or whatever it is. You know what I mean? So those are the kinds of the practical difficulties that, and if you end up having an organization or any kind of policy of zero tolerance, okay, well, even how implemented zero tolerance? Well, we see how it was implemented the Labour Party. The majority of people who were suspended or expelled or investigated were people on the left, and many of them were Jewish. A great many of them are Jewish, and they're Jewish because they were older people who are no holds barred in their language, right? In terms of their criticisms, in terms of their description of the state of Israel. And these are just like old lefty members of like working class British Jews who end up being literally smeared as being anti-Semitic and then pushed out, or for using anti-Semitic tropes and things like that. So it's quite perverse, but it just goes to show that it doesn't matter what your intention of certain policies are. What matters is who wields power in the implementation of those policies. And if you haven't changed the structure of the system itself, then you should always be wary about granting that system more power to beat you over the head with, which is what we see with certain types of rules and laws. I realize I'm sort of digressing now into certain
Mo,
to a different direction.
Have you on?
Anyway, I'll leave it there.
I love the way you circular breathe through all of these answers. It's one of the more amazing things to watch in general.
That's my ADHD, right? That's because my Ritalin is wearing off, right? So
one of the more nefarious lies that we're told as voters is if you just get this person elected, then you can hold their feet to the fire. And what you've just illustrated, Mo, is that is absolutely the furthest thing from the truth. That once they're in a position of real or perceived power, they are exponentially more likely to become adherents to whatever the bubble speak is, and become further and further isolated from the people that get to them. We're running into about 2 hours. So yeah. I think we should go ahead and wind down here. Mo, if you could please give us some final thoughts and let people know where you're writing and how they can find you. That would be tremendous.
So final thought is, do not become despondent. Use this as an opportunity to become more radicalized, to seek out information about how systems of power work from a perspective that has been constantly told, but you just may not be aware is out there. That this isn't a reason to give up being engaged in politics, and by politics I just mean trying to shape society for the better. It just perhaps is a reason to learn more about how it's this is a marathon rather than a sprint, and how power really works, rather than the sort of liberal myth of what we're told, which is a nice story, but I think it's pretty much just that, just a story. You can find me on Twitter, MLmazi, so at MLmazi, MELMAAZI. I write with Sputnik International. Right now I'm only doing interviews, Q&A interviews for them, but I publish with them. I also publish with The Canary, and I have my own blog called theinterregnum.net. I publish at some other sites as well, but if you find me via Twitter, then you'll probably see that stuff. You can see the various groups that I've published. Yeah, that's it. Have a great weekend.
All right.
Thank you very much
before we start doing the closing rounds real quick, I want to take a moment to invite everyone who's watching right now and everyone who will be watching after the fact to our World Press Freedom Day event tomorrow. We are hosting an incredible panel with Cynthia McKinney, Ray McGovern, Kevin Gostola, and Elizabeth Voss. That is going to be a fantastic tribute to WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and World Press Freedom. Andre?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say that, but also we're currently streaming 3 times a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays. Those are subject to change depending on the circumstances, maybe more, maybe less. But I just want to thank Mo for joining us, and I want to thank everybody for hanging out with us in chat and all your questions. I've been putting the action link out. Please remember to take some time to do a few actions for Julian. You can find me on Twitter at Andrew Zigman. You can find all of us on Twitter at action_4 Assange. And again, thank everybody for joining us.
Hi. And my name is Kendra Christian, and thank you to Andrew and Steve and Action for Assange for having me on as a guest host. Thank you, Mohammed, especially. Incredible, so enlightening about a lot of things. Hi to everybody in the chat. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at edebs13. And if you want to follow Denver Free Assange, that's at DNVFreeJA.
If you're just seeing me for the first time, my name's Steve Poikinen. I host a show called Slow News Day. You can find it on YouTube by typing Slow News Day Podcast into the search bar. I am also newly on Rockfin. Please go over there and endorse the channel and support me there, please, because it is an alternative platform to YouTube that I have a lot of hope for. Thank you, Mo. It's always a pleasure to have you on. And if we can connect after the case management hearing on Monday, I would love to have you on Slow News Day for a little recap there. To everyone in the chat, we love you guys. You guys are awesome. And we look forward to doing these and having you be a part of these events with us. Thanks to Sleepy Josh on the 1s and 2s and Kimber the Mean Panda for her work doing graphics. We will see you tomorrow for World Press Freedom Day. And if you're so inclined, join me at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, when Elizabeth Mueller will be coming on to Slow News Day to do a thorough look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership and what a mess it is, how she became a targeted activist through her work in protesting against it, and what it looks like now. It's called the CPTPP now, and it's even impossibly more nefarious than it was when the neoliberals in the Obama administration came up with it. So if you can, please do that, and we will see you tomorrow. Good luck to us all.